The phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I was sitting at my kitchen table at 11:47 at night, staring at a bowl of instant noodles I hadn't touched, watching my screen light up over and over and over again like something was on fire somewhere and I was the only one who could put it out. Except I wasn't going to. Not this time. The group chat, the one they named Family First, which should have been my first warning, had exploded. 43 messages in under 8 minutes. I didn't even have to open them. The previews alone told me everything I needed to know about exactly where this night was going. Asterisk, I can't believe you. Asterisk. Asterisk, after everything we did for you. Asterisk. Asterisk, you've changed. You're not the person we raised. Asterisk. Asterisk, selfish. That's what you are. Completely selfish. Asterisk. I put the phone face down on the table. I picked up my fork. I stared at the noodles. And then I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I laughed. Not because anything was funny, it wasn't. It was the furthest thing from funny. I laughed because I was sitting there in a studio apartment I could barely afford, eating instant noodles at midnight because my bank account had $42 in it 3 days before payday, and my family, the same family I had been quietly bleeding myself dry for over 3 years, was calling me selfish. The word just kept appearing on the screen. Selfish. I picked up the phone and read through the messages slowly, one by one, the way you read a letter from a doctor when you already know the diagnosis isn't good. My aunt. My cousin. My mother's sister. My brother. Even someone I barely spoke to, a cousin twice removed who I hadn't seen in 4 years and who had never once sent me so much as a birthday message, had somehow found their way into this conversation just to add a thumbs down emoji beneath a message that said I had forgotten where I came from. And in all 43 messages, all of them, not a single one mentioned the money. Not the rent I had been sending every single month for 2 years straight. Not the school fees that I transferred like clockwork even when my own bills were stacking up. Not the hospital bill I paid when I should have been building my own emergency fund. Not the time I went without a winter coat for an entire season because there was an urgent situation back home and I didn't want to say no. Not the 3 years of my life I had quietly handed over, piece by piece, month by month, convinced, absolutely convinced, that I was doing the right thing. None of that existed in those 43 messages. Only the word selfish. I stared at the screen until my eyes blurred. Then I put the phone down and said something out loud to no one, to the empty apartment, to the instant noodles going cold in front of me, to the version of myself I had been slowly losing for years. I said, I was the only one sacrificing. And that was the moment I knew I needed to tell this story. Not for sympathy. Not for validation. But because I know with absolute certainty, that someone watching this right now is sitting in a version of that same kitchen. Staring at a version of that same phone. Wondering if they are the problem. Wondering if they really are selfish. Wondering how something that started with nothing but love turned into something that was quietly, systematically destroying them. This story is for you. And before I go any further, thank you. Genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for always coming back to this channel, for watching, for sharing these stories, for the messages you send that remind me why this matters. If this story is already resonating with something you've lived or something you're living right now, please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It costs you nothing and it means absolutely everything to this channel. Now let's get into this properly, because this story is long and it is layered and every single part of it matters. I was 23 years old the first time I paid a bill that wasn't mine. I want you to hold that number for a moment. 23. Because when I look back at it now, I understand something I didn't understand then, that 23 is young in the way that you don't realize you're young until you're older and looking back. At the time, I didn't feel young at all. I had a job. I had a small apartment I rented alone. I had a budget spreadsheet I updated every Sunday night like a religious ritual. I felt like I had things figured out in a way that most people my age didn't, and honestly, privately, quietly, I was proud of that. I had worked for it. I had fought for the stability I felt. I had grown up watching money be a source of constant, grinding stress. My mother worked hard, genuinely, physically, bone-tiringly hard, the kind of hard that ages a person before their time and leaves marks you can see on their face and body. But there was always more month than money. I knew from very early what it meant to wait. To go without. To pretend you weren't hungry because dinner wasn't quite enough to go around and you were the oldest and you understood, even without being told, that you should take less so someone else could have more. I had decided very early, in the wordless way that children decide things that shape everything that comes after, that when I grew up, I would be different. I would be stable. I would be the one who didn't panic when the phone rang. I would be the person who had it together. So when I finally landed my first real job, not a side hustle, not a weekend shift, not something I picked up to fill a gap, but an actual salaried position with benefits and a direct deposit that landed reliably on the same day every 2 weeks, I felt something deep inside me shift. Like a lock clicking open. Like I had arrived somewhere I had been trying to get to for a long time. And the very first thought I had, sitting in my new apartment on the night I got the offer letter, was not about what I would buy for myself or where I would travel or what I would finally be able to afford. The first thing I thought was, now I can help. I want you to understand something crucial before this story goes any further, because it matters to everything that comes after. I was not forced into any of this. Nobody sat me down and issued an ultimatum. Nobody handed me a list of obligations and told me to sign at the bottom. It didn't happen that way. It never does, with these kinds of situations. It happened the way all slow disasters happen, gradually, gently, so naturally, and so incrementally that you don't notice until you're already deep inside it, until the water is at your chin and you're still telling yourself it's fine, you can handle it, this is just what you do. My mother called me about 3 months after I started the job. She wasn't a phone person, never had been, so when her name came up on my screen on a Tuesday afternoon, I felt the small flutter of concern that her calls always triggered. "Hey, Mum. Everything okay?" She paused. The kind of pause I recognized, the pause that meant she had been sitting with something and practicing how to say it and still hadn't quite found the right words. "I hate to ask," she said. "You know I hate to ask. Tell me." "The electricity got cut. They said if we don't pay by Friday, they won't reconnect until." "How much is it?" Another pause, shorter this time. 140. "I'll send it tonight." And I did. And she cried, quietly, the kind of crying you can only hear if you're really listening for it, if you know what it sounds like. And she said, "You're such a good child. I don't know what I'd do without you." And I sat in my little apartment and felt warm in a way I can only describe as purposeful. Like I was doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing. Like everything I had worked for suddenly had a meaning beyond just myself. I didn't see it as the beginning of anything. It was one bill. $140. A problem that existed and I happened to have the solution. Simple. Clean. Done. The second time was 2 months later. My aunt needed help with a medical copay she couldn't cover. $60. I sent it before she even finished explaining the situation. The third time was my cousin's bus pass. $25. My cousin texted me at 10 in the morning and by 10:15 it was handled. Small amounts. Manageable amounts. The kind that individually feel like nothing, like of course you help, like what kind of person would say no to $25 for a bus pass? But I want you to do some math with me, because this is where the story lives, in the math that nobody was doing out loud. By the time I had been working for 12 months, I had quietly, without ever discussing it explicitly, without anyone ever asking me to formally commit to anything, without any conversation about expectations or limits or sustainability, I had become the person the family called when there was a gap. And there was always a gap. There was a gap every month. Sometimes 2 or 3 gaps in a single month, each one arriving with its own emotional weight, its own context, its own reason why this particular gap was different from the last one and required immediate attention. And I filled them. Every one. Because here's what nobody tells you, and I need to say this clearly because it's the part of the story that's hardest to explain to people who haven't lived it. At first, for a real, genuine, sustained period of time, it felt good. It felt right. It felt like love in action. There is a specific kind of pride that lives in being needed, in being capable, in being the one people call when things go wrong. Especially when you grew up watching your mother worry. Especially when you remember the particular humiliation of not having enough. The ability to close that gap for someone you love, there is almost nothing that feels like it. I was the good one. The responsible one. The one who had made it and was bringing others along. That was the story I was telling myself. And for a while, it was even true. But here's the thing nobody warned me about. The thing I had to learn through years of lived experience and a lot of pain. The first time you say yes, you aren't just solving a problem. You are setting a price. You are establishing a rate. You are teaching the people around you, not cruelly, not through any single intentional decision, but through sheer repetition, that this is what you do. This is who you are. This is what you're for. And once that lesson is fully learned, once it becomes the operating assumption of every relationship in your family, it becomes almost impossible to unlearn without a fight that costs you everything. I didn't realize I was setting a standard I would never be allowed to break. The shift happened so slowly that I almost didn't notice it happening at all. Somewhere in the space between year 1 and year 2, the calls changed. The language changed. The energy on the other end of the phone changed in a way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore once you felt it. There is a very specific, very recognizable difference between someone calling you and saying, with genuine vulnerability, "I'm so sorry to bother you, I wouldn't ask if I had anywhere else to turn," and someone calling you and saying, with no preamble at all, "I need you to send something this week." The first one sounds like a request. The second one sounds like an invoice. I started receiving the second one. It wasn't everyone. It wasn't all at once. It crept in the way cold creeps into a room. You never feel the exact moment it starts, you just look up at some point and realize your hands are numb and you're shivering and you don't know how long you've been cold. My cousin, I'll call her Diane, had developed a habit of texting instead of calling. Which meant there was no voice. No warmth. No pretense of relationship or connection or anything beyond pure transaction. Just the amount and the deadline. *K. School fees due Friday. 300. *. That was the whole message. No hello. No how are you. No please or thank you or any acknowledgement that she was making a request rather than issuing a directive. Just the number and the date. I stared at that message for a long time. I read it over and over, trying to find something in it I was missing, some warmth I had misread as coldness, some softness hiding behind the bluntness. There wasn't any. I sent the money anyway. Because the alternative, the confrontation, the explanation, the having to justify why I wanted to be spoken to like a human being, felt so much more exhausting than just sending the money. And I told myself she was just direct. That was just her personality. I was being too sensitive. But I held on to that message. Filed it away somewhere in the back of my mind without fully understanding why. The way you file away small things that don't quite make sense, that don't fit the story you're telling yourself, that you're not ready to look at yet. Then came the month I hesitated. I want to tell you about this month in detail because it is one of the most important moments in this entire story. Not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed. I was going through a genuinely difficult stretch. Nothing dramatic, nothing I would have called a crisis. I wasn't good at calling things crises, I had trained myself out of that, but my car had broken down and the repair cost more than I expected, and my savings had taken a hit that I hadn't fully recovered from. I was fine, technically. I was managing. But I was watching every transaction, moving money carefully, operating with the kind of precision that requires constant attention and leaves no margin for error. And in the middle of all of that, right in the exact middle of my tightest month in over a year, my uncle called about rent. It was the same amount I'd sent before. The same uncle. The same situation. It should have been automatic, the way everything had become automatic. Except this time, before I could stop myself, I heard myself say something I had never said before. Can I send it at the end of the week instead of right now? Silence. Not a brief pause. A long, deliberate, loaded silence of the kind that is not actually silence at all but a form of communication. And then, very carefully, my uncle said, "I thought you were doing well." 5 words. That was his entire response. Not, "Of course, no problem." Not, "Take your time, whenever works." Not any acknowledgement that I was a person with my own financial situation that might sometimes require some flexibility. Just those 5 words, delivered in a tone that managed to communicate, without saying it directly, that if I couldn't send the money immediately, something must be wrong with me. That my hesitation was suspicious. That the fact that I had needs of my own in this particular moment was, somehow, an unexpected and disappointing development. I sent the money that same afternoon. But I sat with the feeling that conversation left me with for days. The specific, uncomfortable feeling of having been managed. Of having opened my mouth for 1 second, 1 hesitation, 1 question, not even a refusal, and been immediately redirected through a carefully placed comment designed to make me feel that my hesitation itself was the problem. I thought about it at night. I thought about it on my way to work. I thought about it in meetings, my mind drifting back to those 5 words and the silence that preceded them and what both of those things told me about the nature of what I was in. Because I understood something that I had been carefully not understanding for over a year. It wasn't a request anymore. It hadn't been a request for a long time. It was an obligation. A recurring charge. A bill they sent me the way my landlord sent me a bill, expected, non-negotiable, with consequences for late payment. Except the consequences here weren't financial. They were emotional. They were relational. They were the withdrawal of warmth, the appearance of disappointment, the careful deployment of guilt through a single sentence, "I thought you were doing well." As if my doing well existed for their benefit. As if my stability was a resource that belonged to them. And the more I gave, the less it seemed to matter. By the middle of year 2, I need you to understand what my life actually looked like on the inside. On the outside, it looked fine. I went to work. I was functional. I showed up. I smiled at the right moments and said the right things, and nobody who knew me casually would have had any idea that anything was wrong. But inside, the financial architecture of my life had been completely restructured by other people's needs, and I was the only one who could see the blueprints. When I had started the job, I opened a savings account. By the end of year 1, it had just over $4,000 in it, which felt, at the time, enormous. Felt like proof that I was building something real, something that would one day protect me the way nothing had protected my mother. I remember checking that balance and feeling genuinely proud in a way that had nothing to do with ego and everything to do with security. By the middle of year 2, that account had $900. I had watched it drain in increments so small that I kept convincing myself each individual withdrawal was manageable. That I would replenish it next month. That this was temporary. That things would stabilize. That eventually the gaps would get smaller and the requests would slow down and I would find my way back to the path I had been on. It was never temporary. The gaps never got smaller. The requests never slowed. I had friends who were talking about investment accounts. Who were booking vacations. Who were upgrading their apartments, buying furniture that wasn't from thrift stores, going out on weeknight evenings without checking their bank balance before they left the house. And I would sit with them at dinner and smile and say things like, "Yeah, I've been thinking about that too, and maybe next year," and carry the weight of a secret that felt too complicated to explain and too shameful to admit. Because how do you explain it? How do you say to someone sitting across from you at a table, I earn a reasonable income, but I am perpetually broke because I have been quietly funding my family for 2 years and I cannot stop because stopping would require a confrontation I am not ready for, and even if I were ready the confrontation would make me the villain, and I am not sure I can survive being the villain when I have spent my whole life being the hero." You don't say it. You smile. You say maybe next year. You split the check carefully and go home and check your balance and feel the specific, quiet, suffocating despair of watching yourself disappear, transaction by transaction, month by month, into a situation you built yourself and don't know how to leave. I delayed getting dental work done for 8 months. Every time I saved the money, something came up. My cousin's car repair. My aunt's electricity. A situation involving my uncle that was never fully explained to me but apparently required exactly $300 to resolve, and when I asked what the $300 was for, the question itself was treated as an offense. I bought my winter coat at a thrift store. Not because I couldn't have afforded a real one if I hadn't been sending money home, I could have, barely, but because every time I looked at my budget, something else was more urgent. Someone else's urgent was always louder than my own. I was surviving. I want to be precise about that word. Surviving. Not living, surviving. There is a difference, and I knew the difference, and knowing it while being unable to change it is one of the loneliest feelings I have ever experienced. And what made it worse, what made the whole thing feel genuinely surreal, was that nobody noticed. Or if they noticed, they didn't ask. Because asking would require them to see me as a person who might be struggling, and I had successfully convinced everyone around me, through years of consistency and silence, that I was fine. That I was the strong one. That I was the stable one. The strong one doesn't struggle. The strong one just gives. So I kept giving. And I kept lying to my friends about how I was doing. And I kept postponing the things I wanted. And I kept building this invisible life inside the visible one, the private ledger of sacrifices that nobody ever acknowledged because nobody was ever supposed to see it. Because seeing it would mean something had to change, and change, in this particular ecosystem, had only ever moved in one direction, toward me giving more, not less. That's when the pressure really started. Not the quiet, ambient pressure that had been building for 2 years, something sharper than that. Something more intentional. It was my Aunt Vera who escalated first, and she did it in the particular way that only she could, which was by making guilt feel so much like love that you had to hold it very still and examine it very carefully before you could tell the difference. She called me on a Saturday morning at 8:15. I was attempting to sleep in, which was a luxury I almost never allowed myself and which I had been looking forward to for weeks. When I saw her name on the screen, I answered immediately because with Aunt Vera, a Saturday morning call meant something might actually be wrong. Nothing was wrong. "I've been thinking about you," she said. "Good things, I hope," I said, still groggy, pulling myself upright against the headboard. "You know what I think about," she said, and her voice had already taken on that particular quality I knew so well, heavy, weighted, like she was speaking from the bottom of something deep. "I think about when you were 7. You remember how sick I got that winter?" "Pneumonia," the doctors said. "And your mother was working those double shifts at the time, no one else could come, so I stayed at your place for 3 weeks. I made dinner every night. I braided your hair on Sundays." "I remember," I said. And I did remember. The details were slightly different from how she was telling them. Aunt Vera had complained constantly throughout that 3-week stay, had made my mother feel guilty for not taking time off work to tend to her personally, had eaten the good food and left the rest for us. But I said I remembered because pointing any of that out would have required a kind of energy I didn't have at 8:15 on a Saturday. "Family takes care of family," she said. "That's what we taught you. That's all any of us ever tried to teach you. You don't turn your back on the people who were there for you when it mattered." I was quiet. "My landlord called me twice this week," she said. And there it was. The pivot. With Aunt Vera, the speech was never just a speech. It was always a runway, and the runway always led to the same landing strip, and the landing strip always had the same name. "How much?" I said. She gave me the number. I told her I'd see what I could do. She said, I know you'll do the right thing, in the particular tone that made it clear she wasn't expressing confidence so much as issuing a reminder that the right thing had already been defined and there was only one of it. I sent the money. But I sat with something afterward that I hadn't quite sat with before. The word she'd used, sacrifice. As in, we sacrificed for you. As in, your stability now is built on our sacrifice then. As in, every good thing you have access to is a debt that is being tracked and will eventually be collected. I had never been handed a bill. But apparently I had been running a tab my entire life. The guilt trips became more systematic after that. More coordinated, almost, though I don't think it was consciously coordinated. I think it was just that everyone had independently discovered what worked and were all, separately, doing the thing that worked. My cousin Diane had refined her approach. Instead of just texting amounts, she'd started prefacing the asks with small performances of affection. A voice message before the request. A reference to a shared memory. Something designed to warm the temperature of the interaction just enough that the ask, when it came, felt less like a demand and more like a natural extension of the connection. Hey, I was thinking about that time we were kids and we used to sneak food from the kitchen at night, do you remember that? Those were good times. Anyway, I wanted to ask, fees are due again and things are really tight this month. The memory was real. The warmth was calculated. And I knew it was calculated, and I sent the money anyway, and hated myself a little for not being able to separate what was real from what was being used. My brother took a different approach. He preferred the comparative model. The appeal to social norms as a form of pressure. He called me one evening, this was maybe 18 months into the pattern, and after the briefest possible small talk, he said, I've been talking to people. Other families. You know what I notice? People take care of their families. That's what people do. Good people, people who were raised right, they don't forget where they came from. I said nothing. I'm just saying, he continued. I hope you're not starting to think that because you have a job now, because things are going well for you, that you're somehow separate from this family. Because that's not how it works. That's not who we are. I want you to notice something about that conversation. He never asked me for anything directly. He never named a number or a bill or a deadline. He simply delivered a sermon about the kind of person he expected me to be, and let the implication of what that person was supposed to do hang in the air between us. It was masterful, in its way. And it worked. I called my aunt the next day and sent money I hadn't planned to send, driven not by any specific request but by the ambient guilt that sermon had deposited in me like sediment. This was the machinery of it. This was how it ran. Not through any single dramatic moment of exploitation but through the constant, low-level management of my sense of self, who I was, what I owed, what a good person looked like, whether I qualified as one. And I let it work on me. 4 months. Because challenging it would have required me to say something that felt unsayable, that I had been doing more than my share for a long time, and that I was tired, and that the gratitude I had been receiving was not proportional to the cost I had been paying, and that I needed things to change. That sentence felt impossible. So instead I kept paying. And I kept shrinking. And the pressure kept building. Now I want to pause here for just a moment, because if you've been watching this long, and I can see that many of you have, then something in this story is connecting with something in your life. And I want to hear about it. Tell me where you're watching from right now. Drop it in the comments, your country, your city, just where you are in the world. And tell me, are you the person in this story? Are you the one who always picks up? Are you the one who hasn't said no yet? Because you are not alone. This channel exists for exactly this reason, for stories like this one, for the moments of recognition that remind you that what you're living through has a name and it isn't your fault. If this video is hitting something real for you, hit the like button right now. And share it with someone who needs to hear it. We'll keep going. I found out the truth by accident. I want to tell you how it happened because the how matters. It wasn't an investigation. It wasn't me looking for evidence. I wasn't suspicious in any active way. I had my private doubts, my quiet discomforts, but I had been so thoroughly trained to override those feelings with duty and love and the pressure of expectation that I wasn't doing anything deliberate about them. It happened at a small gathering. A mutual friend of mine and Diane's, someone who ran in the same circles, someone who genuinely liked both of us and had no agenda whatsoever, mentioned it casually in conversation the way you mention something you assume the other person already knows. We were talking, catching up, the easy back and forth of people who hadn't seen each other in a while, and at some point she said, "Diane's been doing really well lately, actually. She seems happy. Did she tell you about the trip?" I kept my face completely still. I've had practice with this. "What trip?" I said. "Oh, she went away with a group of friends. About 10 days, I think. They went to," and she named a destination. I won't tell you the exact destination because it isn't the point. What I will tell you is that it was not a budget trip. It was not a discount weekend. It was the kind of travel that requires months of planning and a real amount of money set aside specifically for it, the kind of trip you post about, the kind you talk about before and after, the kind that represents a choice to spend real resources on yourself and your enjoyment. I said, "Oh wow, that's wonderful for her." And then I excused myself and found a quiet hallway and stood there for a long moment with my back against the wall. I did the arithmetic in my head. Not the trip specifically, I had no idea what it cost, but the broader picture. The 18 months of school fees. The various emergencies. The situations that required exactly the right amount of money at exactly the right time. The total that, if I added it up honestly, represented years of my own delayed goals, my own untouched savings, my own coat purchased secondhand because I was always finding money for someone else's urgent situation. And Diane who texted me amounts and deadlines without greeting or please or thank you, Diane had been on a 10-day trip. I went back to the gathering. I stayed for another hour because leaving would have required explaining and I didn't have the words yet. I smiled. I talked. I laughed at the right moments. And I filed away what I had just learned in the same place I'd been filing everything else. The place I was starting to understand was not a filing cabinet but a reckoning waiting to happen. I went home and sat down with a notebook. This is not something I had ever done before, sitting down deliberately to quantify what I had given. I had always kept it deliberately vague in my own mind, I realize now, because making it concrete would have required me to act on what I found. But that night, I sat down and I wrote out every amount I could remember. I went back through my bank statements. I found the transfers. I added them up line by line. I am not going to tell you the exact total. I've thought carefully about whether to include it and I've decided it doesn't serve the story the way I want it to, and also because the number isn't really the point is the gap. The gap between what I had given other people and what I had built for myself. The gap between where my savings account should have been and where it actually was. The gap between the life I could have been building and the life I had actually been living. That gap was enormous. And not a single person on the other side of it had ever asked how I was managing. I was draining myself while they were comfortable. I sat at that table with my notebook and my bank statements and I let that sentence land fully, for the first time, without immediately softening it with qualifiers or context or benefit of the doubt. I had been carrying people who were not drowning. Something shifted in me after that night. Not explosively, not yet. More like a slow recalibration, a quiet adjustment of something fundamental in how I was seeing things. I started paying attention differently. Watching patterns I had been too close to see clearly before, or had been too invested in not seeing. I started to notice that the calls I received broke down into a very narrow range of categories. Money. A problem that required money. A situation that was described emotionally but resolved financially. And occasionally, a call that started as a check-in but within 3 or 4 minutes revealed itself to be a preamble for one of the above. When I called just to talk, just to connect, the way people who love each other are supposed to sometimes do, the conversations were short. Distracted. Ended quickly, with vague promises to catch up properly soon that never materialized. But when they called me, the conversations were long and detailed and emotionally intense, because there was something at stake. Because they needed the call to go somewhere. I tested it deliberately, and I want to be honest about that, because I know it sounds cold. It felt cold, doing it. But I needed to know. I delayed a regular transfer by 5 days. I didn't announce that I was delaying it. I didn't say I wasn't sending it. I just didn't send it on the day I usually would have, and I watched what happened. Day 2, a text from Diane. Hey, just checking in on you. Which, in isolation, would have been touching. Day 3, a phone call. Her voice warm, personal, asking how I was doing, saying she'd been thinking about me, asking if everything was alright. The kind of call I had wanted from her for 2 years, arriving now in service of something else entirely. Day 4, a message in the family group chat, not addressed to me directly but clearly visible to me, about how difficult things were for everyone right now and how important it was for family members to look out for each other, especially in hard times. Day 5, a direct message from my aunt. Is everything okay with you? We haven't heard from you. The money landed in Diane's account at the end of day 5. The welfare check stopped. No follow-up. No further curiosity about how I was doing. The concern had run its course. I sat with what that experiment revealed for a very long time. They didn't want me. They wanted the function I performed. And when the function showed signs of pausing, they came looking, not for me, not out of genuine worry about my well-being, but for the reason the function had paused, so they could identify and fix the obstruction and get everything running again. I was not a person in this equation. I was an infrastructure. They didn't want help. They expected access. I made a decision. It came quietly, and I want to describe it accurately because I think there is a mythology around these kinds of decisions. People imagine them as dramatic, as explosive, as the product of a specific moment of revelation. My decision wasn't like that. It came in the same small hours that all my honest thinking had been happening in for months. It came while I was sitting on the edge of my bed at 2 in the morning, not sleeping, not crying, just thinking with a kind of exhausted clarity that I'd never quite accessed before. Thinking, I cannot keep doing this. Not because I don't love them. I do. But because I am disappearing, and nobody who is supposed to love me has noticed, and the disappearing is going to keep happening as long as I allow it. I was going to stop. Not with a speech. Not with an announcement. Not with the confrontation I had been dreading for years. I was simply going to stop sending money I didn't have to people who were not counting the cost. I was going to stop making myself smaller and smaller so that other people could feel whole. I was going to stop paying for a version of family that only existed when I was useful. I took a breath. And I stopped. The first few weeks were quiet in a way that felt almost peaceful, and I let myself enjoy that peace without trusting it completely, because I knew it was only the surface of something that hadn't broken yet. There were a few messages I responded to warmly but without financial follow-through. A few calls that I kept brief and redirected away from anything that would require me to produce an amount or a date. I could feel the confusion on their end. Could feel it in the slight edge that crept into voices, in the careful questions that were trying to understand what had changed without asking directly, because asking directly would require naming what we had all been participating in, and nobody wanted to do that. But then the second month came. And they understood. And everything broke open at once. My phone didn't just ring that night. It erupted. The group chat, the one called Family First, went from dormant to war zone in under 20 minutes. My aunt called 4 times in a single afternoon. Each time I let it ring. Each time she called back within minutes. My cousin sent 17 messages, I counted them slowly, reading each one, and the emotional range across those 17 messages was something I could not have predicted. She moved from confused to wounded to betrayed to furious to wounded again, the temperature swinging so rapidly it was almost dizzying. And then my brother called. When I answered his call, his voice was something I hadn't heard before. Not raised, my brother rarely raised his voice, he was too controlled for that, but cold. Deliberately, carefully cold. "What's going on with you?" he said. "I'm doing okay," I said. "How are you?" "Don't do that. Don't do the small talk thing. You know exactly why I'm calling." "Tell me," I said. A pause. I could hear him breathing, choosing his words. "People are struggling," he said finally. "Real struggling. And you've gone quiet. You're not showing up. That is not who this family raised you to be." I noticed again that he said we. As in, he personally had been part of raising me. As in, his own contributions to my upbringing now granted him standing to evaluate my character. "I've been showing up for a long time," I said carefully. "I'm not in a position to right now." "You have a job," he said, as if this ended the conversation. "Having a job doesn't mean having unlimited resources. It means more than most people in this family have," he said, and now there was an edge to it, something almost accusatory, as if my employment itself was a kind of hoarding. And then his voice dropped lower, became quieter, which was somehow worse than any amount of volume. "After everything this family did for you," he said. "After everything we sacrificed. You're really going to stand there and tell me you can't help?" There it was. The sentence. The one designed to be unanswerable. The one that positioned my entire life as a debt and every moment of my stability as borrowed time on someone else's account. I had thought about this moment. I had rehearsed for it, in the way you rehearse for things you dread, running through possible versions in your head, trying to prepare for what it would feel like when it actually arrived. I said, "I love this family. And I am taking care of myself for the first time in years." He hung up. The group chat exploded within the hour. 43 messages. I've already told you what they said. I'll add now that reading them was a particular kind of experience, the experience of being seen clearly for the first time, except the seeing was hostile, and the clarity was being used as a weapon, and every sentence was designed to make me feel that I had committed a crime by choosing myself. Selfish. Ungrateful. Changed. Forgotten where she came from. Thinks she's better than everyone else. After everything we did. After everything they did. I read all 43. I sat with my back against the wall and I read every single word and I waited, genuinely waited, for the guilt to arrive. Because guilt was what I was supposed to feel. Guilt was the fuel this entire machine ran on. Without it, the engine stopped. But the guilt didn't come. Not the guilt they were trying to install. What came instead was something I hadn't expected and wasn't prepared for. Clarity. A cold, clean, absolute clarity about what had happened and how long it had been happening and what it meant. Not anger, I had processed most of the anger already in the months of quiet observation before this moment. Not sadness, exactly, though sadness was part of it. Just clarity. The specific, irreversible clarity of a thing seen too clearly to ever be unseen. The moment I stopped providing, I stopped being valued. And then the silence came. This is the part of the story people never talk about. The part that comes after the explosion. After the group chat burns itself out. After the calls go unanswered enough times that they stop coming. After the messages slow and then stop. The silence. For 3 weeks after that night, my phone was almost entirely quiet. No messages asking how I was. No calls to check in. No one curious about my life in any way that didn't involve something they needed from it. The same people who had been texting me multiple times a week, who had been a constant, demanding background noise in my life for years, were suddenly, completely, resoundingly absent. And I sat in my apartment in that silence and felt something I had not felt in so long that it took me a moment to identify. For the first time in years, no one needed me. I want to be honest about what that felt like, because it wasn't simple. It wasn't pure relief. It was the most complicated feeling I had ever sat with, relief and grief and loneliness and something else I didn't have a word for, something like the feeling of a wound finally being left alone to start healing after years of being reopened. I reached for my phone in that automatic, habitual way I had, scanning for the next emergency, the next request, the next situation that required me to find money I didn't have. The reflex of being needed doesn't leave the moment the need stops. It stays in your hands. In the way you hold your body. In the constant low-level alertness that had become so normal I'd forgotten it wasn't just how existing felt. I started to understand, in the silence, something I had never had space to understand before. I had organized my entire life around being available to other people. And without that structure, without the requests and the transfers and the emergencies, I genuinely didn't know what my life was for. I had forgotten, somewhere in those 3 years, what I wanted when nobody was asking me for anything. What do I want? It sounds simple. It sounds like the most basic possible question. But I sat with it for weeks and I found it genuinely difficult to answer, because the practice of wanting things for myself had atrophied from years of non-use. I had been so busy managing other people's wants that mine had gone underground, covered over, and digging them back up required a patience and gentleness I had never thought to apply to myself. I started small. I fixed my teeth, the dental work I had postponed for 8 months because there was always something more urgent. I sat in the dentist's chair and felt something so disproportionate to the situation that I almost laughed, profound relief. Not just about the teeth. About the act of choosing myself. About putting myself first for once without an emergency compelling me to. I opened the savings account that had been sitting at $900 and I put money in it and I left it there. I checked the balance every week and watched it grow and felt something every time I looked at it that I can only describe as evidence that I existed. That I was building something that was mine. I bought a proper coat. A real one, warm, the kind I should have bought 2 winters ago. I wore it every day that winter and it sounds absurd to say that a coat was significant, but it was significant. It was proof that I was allowed to take up space. That I was allowed to have things. That my comfort was not a luxury to be deferred indefinitely while other people's needs were addressed first. About 2 months into the silence, my mother called. I want to tell you about this call carefully because it matters to how this story ends, and I don't want to get it wrong. My mother and I had always had a relationship that was complicated in the particular way that relationships between mothers and daughters can be complicated, not hostile, not without love, but layered and imperfect and full of things that had never been said clearly. She had not participated in the group chat explosion. She had not sent me any of the furious messages. And when her name appeared on my screen, I held the phone for a moment before answering, unsure of what version of this call I was about to receive. "Hello, Mum." "Hello," she said. And then she was quiet. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence my mother uses to gather herself, and I waited. "Are you okay?" she finally said. "Yeah," I said carefully. "I think so." "Are you?" "I've been thinking," she said. And I could hear that she had, that this call was not impulsive, that she had been sitting with something and had chosen, deliberately, to pick up the phone about it. "You did a lot for us," she said. "More than you needed to. More than was fair." I didn't respond. I was afraid if I said anything she would take it back, smooth it over, qualify it into something smaller. "I don't know when it got to be so much," she said quietly. "I don't know when it stopped being help and started being something else. But I've been sitting here thinking about it, and I think I knew, and I didn't say anything, and that's on me." The silence after that sentence had a different quality from all the others. It held something real in it. Something fragile and true. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," she said, and I heard something in her voice that might have been embarrassment, or grief, or some combination of the two. "I just wanted to call." We talked for 40 minutes that day. About nothing urgent and nothing that required anything from either of us except presence. About what I remembered from childhood and what she remembered from the same years that were sometimes remarkably different. About a book she was reading. About a show. About her garden and my apartment and whether I was eating properly. It was the most normal conversation I had had with my mother in years. Maybe ever. When I hung up, I cried. For the first time since all of this began, through all the pressure and the guilt and the sleepless nights and the 43 messages, I cried. Not from pain. Not from anger. From something softer and more complicated than either of those things. From the recognition that real love, genuine love, the kind worth keeping, the kind that survives the removal of everything else, doesn't disappear when the money does. That call reminded me why I started giving in the first place. Not because I was a function. Not because I owed a debt that could never be fully paid. But because I loved people, and love had just been buried under so much obligation and guilt and financial transaction for so long that I had forgotten what it looked like when it wasn't attached to anything. I rebuilt slowly. I want to be honest about that, it was slow, and it was not linear, and there were months that were harder than others. Months where I questioned myself so thoroughly that I nearly undid everything I had done. Months where I replayed conversations and second-guessed my own memory and wondered if I had been too harsh, too selfish, too quick to withdraw. But I had the bank statements. And I had the experiment with the delayed transfer. And I had 43 messages full of insults that arrived the moment I stopped sending money, and 0 messages asking how I was doing in the weeks when the phone was quiet. And I kept coming back to those things when the doubt got loud. I started seeing a therapist. This was terrifying in the way that all honest self-examination is terrifying, because you go in thinking you know what the problem is, and what you find is usually larger and older and more fundamental than the specific situation that brought you through the door. What I found was this: I had learned, very early, in a house where resources were scarce and needs were large, that my value was connected to my usefulness. That I was loved because of what I could provide, what I could manage, what I could hold together. And I had carried that belief into adulthood like a law of physics, an immovable fact about how the world worked, and I had organized everything around confirming it. I had volunteered myself into the role of provider before anyone even fully asked, because on some deep level I believed that a person who couldn't provide wasn't a person worth keeping. Unlearning that took longer than anything else in this story. It required me to sit with being loved for nothing, no bill paid, no emergency solved, no function performed, and trust that the love was still real. That I was enough without the money. That I was a person worth knowing even when I wasn't the most useful person in the room. Some of the family relationships came back, in different forms. Slower. More careful. More honest. My mother called regularly now. And most of the calls were just calls, not runways, not preambles, just her voice and mine and whatever we had to say to each other that day. One of my cousins reached out about a year later with an apology. It was imperfect, full of qualifications and carefully maintained ego and an unwillingness to fully name what had happened, but it was something. We talked for a long time that day, and I don't know where that relationship ultimately goes, but I'm not closing the door. Others I haven't heard from since the 43 messages. And I've had to make a specific kind of peace with that, the peace that comes from accepting that some relationships exist only within a particular context, and outside of that context, there is nothing to return to. Not because love was never there, but because what was being called love was, in significant part, something else. And that is one of the most painful things I have learned in this entire experience. Not all of what I called family was family. Some of it was just proximity and utility dressed in the language of blood. I want to speak directly to you now, because we are near the end of this story and I have things I need to say that I haven't said yet. If you are the person in your family who always figures it out, the one everyone calls, the one who finds the money, the one who says yes because no feels like a betrayal of everything you were taught love means, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to have limits. You are allowed to be tired. You are allowed to reach the end of what you can give and say, not today, I can't, I need to stop. These are not failures of character. They are not proofs of selfishness. They are honest statements about being human, and being human is not something you should have to apologize for. The people who call you selfish when you finally stop, I want you to think about what that word reveals. Not about you. About them. About the assumption beneath it. The assumption that your giving was not a choice but a requirement. That your resources were not yours but theirs. That the correct and natural state of your existence is to give, and any deviation from giving is a malfunction that needs to be corrected. They will use the words sacrifice and family and remember and loyalty. And I want to be careful here, because those words are not meaningless. Family is real. Loyalty is real. Sacrifice can be an act of love. But none of those words mean what is being implied when they are used this way. Family does not mean unlimited financial access. Sacrifice is not the same thing as being sacrificed. Remembering where you came from does not mean staying there financially, emotionally, indefinitely, funding everyone else's journey while you stand still and your savings drain and your dreams get postponed 1 month at a time until one day you realize you stopped believing in them entirely. You are not selfish for protecting your own life. You are not ungrateful for setting a limit. You are not cruel for deciding that love is not the same thing as money. And there is something else I want to say, something harder and more important than all of that. The guilt they are using on you is not yours to carry. It was placed on you. It was placed carefully, over time, through repetition and emotional pressure and the strategic deployment of your own love against you. You did not generate that guilt. You inherited it through years of being managed. And you are allowed, you are more than allowed, you are entitled, to put it down. Walking away from what was breaking you is not abandonment. It is the most fundamental act of self-preservation there is. And choosing yourself, choosing your future, choosing your peace, choosing to be a whole person instead of a resource that gets used until it runs dry, that is not something you ever have to apologize for. They called me selfish. But I was the only one who had been sacrificing the entire time. And the moment I finally stopped, the moment I chose myself for the first time in years, I didn't break. I didn't fall apart. I didn't become the villain they wrote me as in 43 messages I will never forget. I became free. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. I mean that more than I can put into words. This took a long time to be ready to tell, and the fact that you are still here, at the end, having stayed for all of it, that means something real to me. If any part of this story felt like looking in a mirror, if you recognized yourself in any moment of it, in the giving or the exhaustion or the guilt or the silence or the slow, painful process of choosing yourself, I want to hear from you. Drop it in the comments right now. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. Tell me what part of this hit the closest. Tell me where you are in your own version of this story, whether you're still in it or just coming out of it or somewhere in the complicated middle. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, someone who is exhausted and stretched and being called selfish for the first time they've tried to breathe, please share this video with them right now. Don't wait. They need to hear it, and you have the power to get it to them. Hit the like button if this story moved you. Subscribe to this channel if you want to be here for the next one, because there are more stories coming, stories just like this one, stories that are honest and real and that don't pretend any of this is simple. You are not alone in this. Whatever you are carrying, whatever version of this story belongs to you, you are not alone. Take care of yourself today. Not because no one else will, but because you deserve to be taken care of. And sometimes, the most important person who can do that is you. I'll see you in the next one.